Okay, I'm sorry that cut off there. So, still on chapter 9. I was so stiff. Let's see. I can't do it, Mama. I said, I've gone too far. Papa came in from the barn. What's the matter? He asked. You a little stiff? A little stiff, Mama exclaimed. Why, he can hardly put his clothes on. Aw, he'll be all right, Papa said. If I know anything about swinging an axe, it won't be long before he's as limber as a rag. Mama just shook her head and started putting her breakfast on the table. While we were eating, Papa said, You know, I woke up several times last night, and each time I was sure I had a hound bawling. It sounded like old Dan. I quit the table on the run and headed for my doghouse. I didn't have to go all the way. Little Ann met me on the porch. I asked her where old Dan was and called his name. He was nowhere around. Little Ann started acting strangely. She whined and stared toward the river bottoms. She ran out of the gate, came back, and reared up on me. Mama and Papa came out on the porch. He's not there, I said. I think he's gone back to the tree. I don't think he'd do that, would he? Mama said. Maybe he's around someplace. Have you looked in the doghouse? I ran and looked. He wasn't there. Everybody be quiet and listen, I said. I walked out beyond the gate a little ways and whooped as loud as I could. My voice rang like a bell in the still, frosty morning. Before the echo had died away, the deep "ow" of old Dan rolled down in the river bottoms. He's there, I said. He wanted to make sure the coon stayed in the tree. You see, Mama, why I have to get that coon? I can't let him down. Well, I never in my life, she said. I had no idea a dog loved to hunt that much. Yes, Billy, I can see now, and I want you to get him. I don't care if you have to cut down every tree in those bottoms. I want you to get that coon for those dogs. I'm going to get him, Mama, I said, and I'm going to get him today if I possibly can. Papa laughed and said, Looks like there wasn't any use in building that scarecrow. All you had to do was tell old Dan to stay and watch the tree. I left the house in a run. Now and then I would stop and whoop. Each time I answered by the deep voice of old Dan. Little Ann ran ahead of me. By the time I reached the big tree, their voices were making the bottoms ring. When I came tearing out of the underbrush, old Dan threw a fit. He tried to climb the sycamore. He would back way off, then bawling and running as fast as he could, he would claw his way far up the side. Little Ann, not to be outdone, reared up and placed her small front paws on the smooth white bark. She told the ringtail coon that she knew he was there. After they had quieted down, I called old Dan to me. I'm proud of you, boy, I said. It takes a good dog to stay with the tree all night, and there wasn't any need for you coming back. The coon wouldn't have gotten away. That's why we built the scarecrow. Little Ann came over and started rolling in the leaves. The way I was feeling toward her, I couldn't even smile at her playful mood. Of course you feel good, I said in an irritated voice, and it's no wonder. You had a good night's sleep in that nice warm doghouse, but old Dan didn't. He was down here in the cold all by himself watching the tree. The way you're acting, I don't believe you care if that coon gets away or not. So Billy's really irritated at Little Ann because she did not go be with old Dan when he went off to guard the tree. And he's kind of thinking, is she even going to hunt for coons? I would have said more, but then I noticed something. I walked over to take a better look. There, scratched deep in the soft leaves, were two little beds. One was smaller than the other. Looking at Little Ann, I read the answer in her warm gray eyes. Old Dan hadn't been alone when he had gone back to the tree. She, too, had gone along. There was no doubt in the early morning she had come home to get me. So Little Ann had gone and been there all night with old Dan, but then she went to get Billy in the morning. There was a lump in my throat as I said, I'm sorry, little girl, I should have known. The first half hour was torture. At each swing of the axe, my arms felt like they were being torn from their sockets. I gritted my teeth and kept hacking away. My body felt like it did the whole time my sister rolled me down the hill, the time my sister rolled me down the hill in a barrel. As Papa had said, in a little while, the warm heat from the hard work limbered me up. I remembered that what my father did when he was swinging an axe. At the completion of each swing, he said, Ha! I tried it. Kerwham! Ha! Kerwham! Ha! I don't know if it helped or not, but I was willing to try anything to hurry the job. Several times before noon, I had to stop and take my chips out of the way. I noticed that they weren't the big, even, solid chips like my father made when he was chopping. They were small and seemed to crumble up and come all to pieces. Neither were the cuts neat and even. They were ragged and looked more like the work of beavers, but I wasn't interested in any beautiful tree chopping. All I wanted was to hear the big sycamore stop popping. Along in the middle of the afternoon, I felt a stinging in one of my own hands. When I saw it was a blister, I almost cried. At first there was only one, then two. One after another, they rose up on my hands like small white marbles. They filled up and turned a pale pinkish color. When one would burst, it was all I could do to keep from screaming. I tore my handkerchief in half and wrapped up my hands. This helped for a while, but when the cloth began to stick in the raw flesh, I knew it was the end. Crying my heart out, I called my dogs to me and showed them my hands. I can't do it, I said. I've tried, but I just can't cut it down. I can't hold the axe any longer. Little Ann whined and started licking my sore hands. Old Dan seemed to understand. He showed his sympathy by nuzzling me with his head. Broken-hearted, I started for home. As I turned from the corner of my eye, I saw Grandpa Scarecrow. It seemed to be laughing at me. I looked over at the big sycamore. It looked so little being cut down, a small wedge of solid wood that was holding it up. I let my eyes follow the smooth white trunk up to the huge spreading limbs. Sobbing, I said, "You think you've won, but you haven't. Although I can't get the coon, neither can you live, because I have cut off your breath of life." And then I thought, why kill the big tree and not accomplish anything? I began to feel bad. Kneeling down between my dogs, I cried and prayed, "Please, God, give me the strength to finish the job. I don't want to leave the big tree like that. Please help me finish the job." I was trying to rewrap my hands so I could go back to work when I heard a low droning sound. I stood up and looked around. I could still hear the noise but couldn't locate it. I looked up. High in the top of the big sycamore, a breeze had started the limbs to swaying. A shudder ran through the huge trunk. I looked over my head at the big black gum tree. Not one limb was moving. On its branches, a few dead leaves hung silent and still. One dropped and floated lazily toward the ground. Over on my left stood a large hackberry. I looked up to its top. It was still as a fence post. Another gust of wind caught in the top of the big tree. It started popping and snapping. I knew it was going to fall. Grabbing my dogs by their collars, I backed off to safety. I held my breath. The top of the big sycamore rocked and swayed. There was a loud crack that seemed to come from deep inside the heavy trunk. Fascinated, I stood and watched the giant of the bottoms. It seemed to be fighting so hard to keep standing. Several times I thought it would fall, but in a miraculous way it pulled itself back into the perfect balance. The wind itself seemed to be angry at the big tree's stubborn resistance. It growled and moaned as it pushed harder against the wavering top. With one final grinding, creaking sigh, the big sycamore started down. It picked up momentum as the heavy weight of the overbalanced top dove for the ground. A small ash was smothered by its huge bulk. There was a lightning crack as the trunk snapped. In its downward plunge, the huge limbs stripped the branches from its smaller trees. A log-sized one knifed through the top of the water oak. Splintered limbs flew skyward and rained out over the bottoms. With a cyclone roar, the big tree crashed to the ground, and then silence settled over the bottoms. Out of the broken, twisted, tangled mass streaked a brown, furry ball. I turned my dogs loose and started screaming at the top of my voice, "Get him, Dan! Get him!" In his eagerness, old Dan ran head on into the bur oak tree. He sat down with his deep voice, told the river bottoms that he had been hurt. It was Little Ann who caught the coon. I heard the ringtail squall when she grabbed him. Scared half to death, I snatched up a club and ran to help her. The coon was all over her. He climbed up on her head, growling, slashing, ripping, and tearing. Yelping with pain, she shook him off, and he streaked for the river. I thought surely he was going to get away. At the very edge of the river's bank, she caught him again. I was trying hard to get a lick in with my club, but couldn't for the fear of hitting Little Ann. Through the tears in my eyes, I saw the red, blurry form of old Dan sail into the fight. He was a mad hound. His anger at the bur oak tree was taken out on the coon. They stretched old Ringy out between them and pinned him to the ground. It was savage and brutal. I could hear the dying squalls of the coon and the deep growls of old Dan. In a short time, it was all over. With sorrow in my heart, I stood and watched while the dogs worried the lifeless body. Little Ann was satisfied first, and I had to scold old Dan to make him stop. carrying the coon by the hind leg, I walked back to the big tree for my axe. Before leaving for home, I stood up and looked at the fallen sycamore. I should have felt proud over the job I had done, but for some reason I couldn't. I knew I would miss the giant of the bottoms, for it had played a wonderful part in my life. I thought of the hours I had whiled away staring at its beauty and how hard it had been finding the right name for it. I'm sorry, I said. I didn't want to cut you down, but I had to. I hope you understand. I was a proud boy as I walked along in the twilight of the evening. I felt so good even my sore hands had stopped hurting. What boy would have been proud? Hadn't my little hounds treed and killed their first coon? Along with then I decided I was a full-fledged coon hunter. Nearing our house, I saw the whole family had come out on the porch. My sisters came running, staring wide-eyed at the dead coon. Laughing, Papa said, "Well, I see you got him." "I sure did, Papa," I said. I held the coon up for all to see. Mama took one look at that lifeless body and winced. "Billy," she said, "when I heard that big tree fall, it scared me half to death. I didn't know but it had fallen on you." "Aw, Mama," I said, "I was safe. Why, I backed off to one side. It couldn't have fallen on me." Mama just shook her head. "I don't know," she said. "Sometimes I wonder if all mothers have to go through this." "Come on," Papa said. "I'll help you skin it." While they were tacking the hide on the smokehouse wall, I asked Papa if he had noticed any wind blowing that evening. He thought a bit and said, "No, I don't believe I did. I've been out all day, and I'm pretty sure I haven't noticed any wind. Why did you ask?" "Oh, I don't know, Papa," I said, "but I thought something strange happened down in the bottoms this afternoon." "I'm afraid I don't understand," said Papa. "What do you mean, something strange happened?" I told him about how my hands had gotten so sore I couldn't chop anymore, and how I had asked for strength to finish the job. "Well, what's so strange about that?" he asked. "I don't know," I said, "but I didn't chop the big tree down. The wind blew it over." "Why, that's nothing," Papa said. "I've seen that happen a lot of times." "It wasn't just the wind," I said. "It was the way it blew. It didn't touch another tree in the bottoms. I know because I looked around. The big tree was the only one touched by the wind. Do you think God heard my prayer? Do you think he helped me?" Papa looked at the ground and scratched his head. In a sober voice, he said, "I don't know, Billy. I'm afraid I can't answer that. You must remember the big sycamore was the tallest tree in the bottoms. Maybe it was up there high enough to catch the wind where the others couldn't. No, I'm afraid I can't help you there. You'll have to decide for yourself." It wasn't hard for me to decide. I was firmly convinced that I had been helped.